We're going to start off this morning with Bill Moore finishing up and showing us a few of his overheads. He's promised he's going to keep it a little short and maybe only tell one joke. Okay? So Bill, why don't you come up here as soon as our helper here gets the screen up and the overhead in here. So might be a few minutes. While we're doing that, there's an announcement I want to make. I want everyone. Is anybody sitting here? Yeah, it did well. And for all of you that don't know, we're having a neural therapy seminar in June. Franz Hopper's coming back. Alberto Ducci's going to be here to translate. It's going to be hands-on. We're going to have monitors so that everybody doesn't need to crowd around. I find out how they do it. We're also going to show his videos that he's made up. There's all about 5 of them are about a half hour long on neural therapy. Neural therapy is one of the premier ways of re-regulating the ground substance as a helper. It's not the total answer. Another thing, Gary Bassett asked me to read this is a proof of the promotional material from Dan Clark's Bioactive Nutritionals, and it's a vibrational medicine and biological dentistry. We're on the same bill together, and it's Ed Arana, Gary Verrigan, Gary Bassett, and Doug Leber. And it's going to be in Florida at the Hilton Florida Center, Orlando, Florida, on March 17th and 18th. It's a Saturday and Sunday. So we'll be out there talking to the physicians and chiropractors and dentists in the Florida area. And I think Sam said he was going to try to come down to San Francisco. So those are the 2 things that we have coming up. 1991, we plan to have a first International Congress of Biological Medicine and Dentistry at Turtle Bay Hilton on Oahu's North Point. And we're going to have it in conjunction with the East-West Foundation, the East-West Medicine Congress. So all the doctors from China and Taiwan. This year they had 120 from Taiwan, about 10 from mainland China, and it was a good blending of knowledge. So we're still working on that. Anybody else have an announcement to talk about or anything? Visit the exhibitors, buy their products, support everything that's going on here. Yes.
Marina Del Rey on the weekend, let's see, that's the 23rd, 24th, and 25th. The California Acupuncture Association has invited me to give a 3-hour lecture on electrodiagnosis. So that's when 23rd, 24th, and 25th is a conference. I haven't got what month? March. So that's nice. I didn't hear about it.
Okay, and then a reminder, Doug, we're going to have Bill talk for just a few minutes before, because he didn't get finished up last night. Terry?
Are we looking into this INDs as an academy?
Yeah, I think that we're going to do that. Mm-hmm. Anything that works. Okay, Bill, come on up and you can move into the phone here.
you see them, I don't know what I'm talking about. I usually don't know what I'm talking about anyhow, but,
That's on tape, we got that.
okay. While we're waiting to get all this set up, I want to amplify a few of the remarks I made last night. I want to tell you guys why it's so important, you know, when you have these troubles, to sue the board members individually. If you think they're putting you through misery, let me tell you the misery their lawyers are going to put them through. You don't sue them as a board, you sue them as individuals. All right? They're going to have to take this lawsuit to their lawyer. And you think you have a thief, you don't even have thieves that represent these guys. This guy's going to come in and say, what does all this mean? This lawyer's going to look at it and say, oh my God, federal antitrust. Fred, thank God you came to us in time. Only we could help. Let me get a couple of partners in here now. Listen, now, we're going to reduce our ordinary fee down to only $2.25 an hour, $225 an hour for each guy working on this. You better bring us in about $150,000 to get started as a deposit, and we'll arrange a mortgage on your office and your home. This is a serious matter. And from that point on, this guy and your lawyer will play a duet like you've never heard before. They will call each other all kind of names in public, and then meet at night and buy each other drinks and say, oh, you're such a wonderful guy. Keep it up forever. Let me tell you what is a perpetual motion machine. It's a lawsuit where the lawyers on both sides are getting paid by the hour. So when you sue the board, and they begin to get a taste of what they've been dishing out, right? I mean, they get into real pain. They have never felt pain before till they go to their lawyer. And they have grabbed the tiger by the tail, and they will come to the well and drink. They will say, well, these quacks aren't such bad guys. I mean, after all they were trying to do was help their patients. And this was a terrible misunderstanding. And maybe we can work something out. And their lawyer's going to say, don't go talk to that son of a bitch. No. Let me go talk to him. When the pain gets bad enough, peace will reign in the valley and you'll be left alone. Very few of these lawsuits will ever progress to the courthouse because no one can afford to pay the thieves that have to take it to the courthouse. You know. And so when you sue each member of the board individually, and the last time I did this, we had to go to the court and get them to order. The Attorney General could not represent them. They had to hire their own lawyers, so the taxpayers were going to pay for their individual crimes. That's when peace came. And that's when peace will come every time. Because you don't really know anything about pain until you try to pay a lawyer by the hour. I told some of y'all this last night, this riddle. Have you heard the riddle about the locked room? There was a room, it had a table and 3 chairs, and there were 3 individuals seated in that room around the table. Expensive lawyer, a cheap lawyer, and a tooth fairy. There was $1,000 cash on the table. The lights went out. When the lights came back on, the money was gone. Who got the money? She figured out it had to be the expensive lawyer because cheap lawyers and tooth fairies are myths, right?
Also tell them about the new name that you're going for the problem.
Yeah, from now on, fellas, you never want to talk about the fluoride problem or the mercury problem. It's the mercury fluoride problem or the fluoride mercury problem. Right?
Since we got fluoride going out, mercury's...
That's because you got a lot of publicity fixing to break and already breaking on fluoride. So this is called a mixed bag. You don't understand what a mixed bag is when you assert an unassailable position and attach a dubious position to it and insist that they be accepted as unitary whole. Never talk about the fluoride problem or the mercury problem. It's always the mercury fluoride problem. It's the toxic problem. Talk about the toxicrats. They're standing in the way of us cleaning up the environment. You know, but always say mercury fluoride. And pretty soon everybody else will say mercury fluoride, and then pretty soon everybody will think mercury fluoride. And you got your battle half won. Someone was talking about that last night. You create reality in this world with your mouth, right? You say it often enough, it becomes a reality. Now, I happen to think that both of these problems are real, and I think that they're interrelated. As a matter of fact, I think they're the AIDS virus that the allopaths are talking about. I think that things like this is what causes AIDS. And if I can convince the public of that, we'll all go out and lynch these guys. There's a lot of scientific support for what I'm saying. I'm going to talk about that in a minute when we have the slides. The Association of Eclectic Physicians publishes a journal, Quantum Medicine, that I'll pass around and some of you can look at, in which they address that problem. And quite seriously, it is our position that AIDS is not an infectious disease, that AIDS is an environmental disease. And there's lots of scientific evidence to back that up. Mercury and fluoride are two of the things in our environment that are causing this. And when the public becomes aware of this, that will hasten the downfall of this evil empire. I mean, allopathic medicine has to believe in an invading entity. And so they had to find a virus. But there's plenty of proof that that virus is non-pathogenic. Dr. Duesberg up here in Berkeley, who is one of the world's foremost retrovirologists, has written any number of articles in which he said it's utterly impossible for HIV to cause any disease. He joins me in our challenge to the National Cancer Institute to send us a gallon of this stuff we want to have a cocktail party. I want to drink HIV, I'll shoot it up, I'll shampoo it, I'll brush my teeth with it. Because I am convinced that the only disease it's ever caused, or ever will cause, is called chronic and relapsing tax fund hemorrhagic fever in the Potomac Basin. That's a way of ripping the public off. But they've got everybody scared, and they're going to spend billions of dollars, pouring it into research to find the vaccine that's going to drive this demon out of the sufferers. In the meantime, the toxicrats are pouring the demon into our environment. The AIDS virus, let's get into the first one of these slides about that. All right. How do you turn this thing up? This is the AIDS virus. These are all the things that we're pouring into our water, our rivers, our soil, and our bodies that are burning out our immune systems. Now, early on, before the AIDS scare ever came along, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences held a seminar, just mentioned in the paper I gave you last night, on the biological relevance of immune suppression due to environmental, genetic, and therapeutic factors. Many of the drugs that are the product of the cartel that runs allopathic medicine are immune toxic. They suppress immunity. We saw AIDS cases in Germany at the end of World War II. We didn't know what we were seeing. These were people who were suffering severe protein and fat malnutrition, and were severely stressed, and they were living in a filthy environment, and they were dying right and left. And some of them, when you look back on them now, they had exactly the same symptoms of the early AIDS patients, even had PCP. There was an epidemic of pneumocystis carinii pneumonitis all over Europe right after World War II. Probably had to do with the unavailability of seed oils for food, because the Germans were using all the seed oils both in Germany and in the confirmations to build munitions with. And it took 5 or 6 years till these people's immunity got built back up. Those were the early AIDS patients, and there's some books now that track some of in the Czechoslovakian literature particularly. You're going to see this whenever there's disaster areas. You're going to see it whenever there is wide-scale protein and fat malnutrition, and that frightens me somewhat in some of the health diets that some people eat. And because the allopaths have to have a demon, their new demon is cholesterol, right? And I think margarine is probably a large cause of a lot of this. Margarine is an immunosuppressive substance. That's why the homosexuals were some of the first that got hit, and they had a lot of nasty habits. One of the anal lubricants that they used were hydrogenated fats. We did a lot of studies on that. Now, that makes your problem relevant to the entire problem that we're facing here. The dental profession is adding 100 tons of mercury a year to this environmental problem. Is that the current figure that they're using, 100 tons? 200,000 pounds, of which I guarantee you a quarter of it goes directly into the water supply. Well, they don't get it all in the amalgam, so they squeeze it out, they drop it. And a lot of it's going in to replace amalgams that they're taking out. And those get ground up and they get into the water supply too. That's why our dolphins and marine mammals on both coasts and in the Gulf, last week it was Texas, where the whales come to shore. Out here you had it with several marine mammals. On the East Coast we've had it with several marine mammals. They're dying of AIDS. They're dying of AIDS because they're getting all these pollutants that are washing down the groundwater and the rivers out to the ocean, and they don't go out to sea, they hang around the coast. And these marine mammals live along the coast and eat seafood along the coast, right high on the seafood chain. The difference is they don't have any hands, so they can't gut these animals. And they have to eat the whole animal, so they get the liver and the kidneys and all that part that really concentrates the toxins. And they are dying of classic AIDS, just like human beings are dying of AIDS. This is an environmental problem, and mercury and fluoride are a large part of that problem. And I say that you can and should enlist the environmental movement in your fight. They will back you 100%. You know, you're not without allies when you're picked on. You just haven't known who your allies should be. When you get in the war, the first thing you got to do is identify who are my enemies, who are my allies. And Van Clausewitz said, you know, when I'm in a war, the enemy of my enemy is my ally. Look around for people who will help you. The environmentalists will certainly help you. Lay people have understood this a lot better than professionals have. There are a whole lot of people in the world, you know, that don't believe in the germ theory of disease anymore. And they know that this is the truth. And this is the truth that, you know, you should join their fight, they should join your fight, and move out together, and they will support you. And you're dead, you left alone by the allopathic establishment. Right? I went over this case last night. Did everybody get a copy of the North Carolina decision we talked about?
Not yet.
No. I will briefly touch on that decision because I have it on overhead.
That's one there you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, we made it up, it's in the packet. The packet of refunds, $15 and you can get them.
Part of this decision that I think is so important, this paragraph right here. Implicit provision granting the board power to revoke a license for practices not in conformity with the standards of acceptable prevailing medical practice is a requirement that the non-conforming practices endanger or harm the public in some way. Without that implicit requirement, the law would permit the Board of Examiners to suspend the license of any physician whose methods or practices, though harmless or even beneficial to his patients and the public, differ in some particular from those of other practitioners. Such unqualified power by an administrative board agency would be contrary to the public interest and was not the legislature's to give in any event. Now, this is a judge in his oblique fashion, the way they do it, saying that that law would be unconstitutional. Courts never decide the constitutional issue if they can decide it on the legal issue. But what he said was not the legislature's to give in any event. He's saying that under the Constitution, the legislature could not give the bump court authority to take your license away unless the bump could demonstrate that your practice, your heretical practice, was harmful to the public. They can't take your license away simply because you're different. Now, that's a very important decision, and it's in that thing, and when you get into these problems, I think it's a recent decision. It was only decided in September of last year. And it's an appellate court in one of the states saying, some other courts have said that in the past, but this is the most recent one, and it happened to be aimed at homeopathy.
If it's in the appellate court, is it applicable to other states or just that state?
Well, it's binding in that state, but the other states usually will listen to it and follow it as a precedent, particularly if there's no precedent to the contrary. I think that this would be beneficial, for instance, for Privatera to have had at the time he was attacking 1707.1 of the California Code. This is a state that says you just can't outlaw a medical procedure simply because it's different and because you don't like it. You must show harm to the public or to an individual. That means an end to these board-generated cases where there wasn't a complaining patient. They just, guests never had a patient complain. The board just came in, so we don't like this homeopathy, we're not going to put up with it. And they generated it on their own motion. That means an end to that sort of thing.
Bill, don't they have an easy way to make that happen? No, all they do is they allege that they went to the homeopath or they went to me and the patient therefore was denied access to good care while they're wasting time seeing me?
Implicit in this is that the harm to the public has got to be something greater than mere denial of orthodox treatment. You tie that up with the Second Circuit's decision in what's the guy in New York, Ravici case.
Okay.
And the Second Circuit said while a patient should exercise reasonable care for his own welfare, the law permits him to go outside of orthodoxy to find unorthodox treatments. The mere denial of access to orthodox treatment by offering an unorthodox treatment is not going to be harm to the public. The public has freedom of choice. And of course, usually these patients that make resort to unorthodox practitioners have already had orthodox treatment before they come in. It's a rare patient. I want to run briefly through two other things. Maybe some of you like to note this down. This is the federal code. This is Title 15, United States Code, Section 26. This is the one that gives consumers and private parties the right to intervene in these lawsuits we're talking about. Any person or association shall be entitled to sue for and have injunctive relief in any court of the United States having jurisdiction over the parties against threatened loss or damage by a violation of the antitrust laws. That's the one we used in the midwife case to have all of the faculty of the University of Georgia come in and intervene in their private lawsuit. It's also the one we use in some of the naturopath cases to have consumers come in and say that their interests are being threatened because the state was trying to deny them access to low-price naturopathy and force them into monopoly medicine, running the price up and threatening their harm to their health by forcing them to undergo allopathic treatment when they had more general naturopathic treatments available. And this kind of thing flies with courts. Now, to my amazement, most lawyers don't know that this exists. It's right there in the antitrust laws, and there are 76 sections in the antitrust law. And most of us may not have read them since law school, but this one, Title 15, Section 26, is the one that gives interested consumers an absolute right to come in. I mean, they don't even have to intervene. They can file their own lawsuit. And all they have to show is that their interests are threatened. I think everybody that's interested in this ought to make a note of that, or maybe I should have given you that last night to pass around.
How many persons would it take to qualify?
2 or more. And another interesting thing while we're talking about that, the statute of limitations on Section 1 and 2 cases is 1890. That's the year they passed that act. They didn't put a statute of limitations in it. Anything they've done since 1890, they can be sued for, particularly if it's a monopolization. You can see the reason for that. It sometimes takes 20 or 30 years to monopolize. So the court can and should consider anything that happened since 1890 as an offense under that. Now, this is the act that ultimately will break their back. It's like I told you last night, you know, what they had to do in order to get their monopolies, they had to standardize medicine. And the destandardization of medicine is one means of breaking up the monopoly. When you sue for monopoly, the court's not going to fine them. The court, in the monopoly case, takes whatever action is necessary to destroy the monopoly, to create competition. And if enough consumers come in screaming monopoly and we want it broken up because of the costliness, it's a compelling argument today. Healthcare last year cost this nation $611 billion. That's over $500 billion. That's the second largest item in our entire national budget. The only thing Americans spent more money on than healthcare last year was food. And we can't, and the federal government pays about a third of that. Insurance carriers pay about a third of it, and a third of it's paid out of people's pockets. People who pay for it out of their own pockets already know what to do about it. They go wherever they want to get their health care. The insurance industry is, of course, controlled by providers, and they're part of the problem. One of the solutions is to break up their monopoly. We are working very hard on a healthcare cooperative program. The Association of Eclectic Physicians with a number of other organizations has formed a coalition of health organizations, which I hope this organization will see fit to join, is free to join, so we can work together on these programs. One of the first programs we've launched is a healthcare cooperative. The second one is a national study of the efficacy and cost effectiveness of all healthcare modalities. That's going to be undertaken by a large commission of our people. We're going to pay absolutely no attention to anything that anybody's ever said before. We're going to reassess all these things, both as to their efficacy and as their cost effectiveness. And we're going to, assess allopathic modalities, homeopathic modalities, all modalities. And Russ Jaffe, I don't know if you know Russ Jaffe, he's an MD, PhD, he used to be with the National Institutes of Health. Russ is going to be the chairman of that commission. It's going to be run in a straightforward fashion. It's going to be published over the next 5 years in 12 volumes. So for a change, when you go before your board, you're going to have something by respectable people who assess what you're doing. You should also consider very sharply in this organization publishing doctrines, tenets, and standards and the type of practice that you do. When you get to court, courts don't recognize allopathy, they don't recognize the monopoly. The courts always consider that there are many different types of practitioners and they all practice according to their own doctrines, tenets, and standards. The only trouble the judge has when you scream that you're practicing in accordance with your doctrines, tenets, and standards, he says, well, show them to me. Where are they? How can I determine what they are? And if you can walk up and say, here they are, Your Honor, my association publishes doctrines, tenets, and standards. He's got to say if you're practicing in conformity with those, that you are practicing good dentistry, good medicine, whatever you're doing. Now, the Association of Eclectic Physicians, it publishes doctrines, tenets, and standards for eclectic medicine every year. AMPS used to publish theirs, Gary, I don't know, ACAM, published theirs for how to do chelation. And the courts have to accept those. The courts view all schools of medicine impartially. They don't give any favor in any one. Courts move slowly, In the last century, there were many schools of medicine. As far as the court's concerned, they still exist. And you can create new schools of medicine or health care. But in order to do so, you have to have the indicia of a school of medicine. You have to have an organization. You have to have published doctrines, tenets, and standards, and rules that you practice by. Otherwise, the court can't tell what you're talking about. They should be drafted by a committee, they should be voted on by the membership, and they should be published and distributed. Then when you go up before the board, you can just say, so, listen, buddy, I'm not doing it your way because I have my own doctrines, tenets, and standards, and I'm not going to do it your way. I'm going to do it my way, and here's my way. And if you don't like it, let's go see the judge and let the judge tell you that I have to do it my way, not your way. But if you don't publish it, as far as the court's concerned, it just don't exist. You understand what I'm saying? Now I want to show you a little bit about this conspiracy that I'm talking about with the National Council Against Health Fraud. You know this bird, John E. Doty's?
Yes.
Yeah, he's a
Dental Journal.
He's a dentist in private practice in Woodhaven, New York, and he's director of the New York chapter of the National Council Against Health Fraud. And he goes down here and he lists all of the quackery that's going on in dentistry. Right? Reflexology, acupuncture, nutritional counseling, kinesiology, TMJ, cranial osteopathy, mercury toxicity, holistic dentistry, wellness. All right, that's the first publication. That was 3 years ago in the Washington Post, Second Opinion. Then the next one we see I'll turn over the other. There you go. This is the ADA News, all right, June 1st, 1987. ADA is investigating ways to assess the level of use of unorthodox therapy in dentistry. Dr. Needley, PhD, ADA Division of Scientific Affairs. He starts listing all the things. Particularly concentrates on mercury amalgam. And he promises that here's the old tired line from the National Council Against Health Fraud. Unorthodox therapy deprive patients of tested, proven therapies. They promised a study in a few months, and here's part of the study. Most of you may be familiar with this study. This is the ADA Journal. Here's our friend Jug Ears Jarvis, head of the National Council Against Health Fraud. Daniel B. Oliver, y'all know Oliver? He's a dentist, isn't he?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And, here's Doty's again, Charles Green. Here's the wind-up of that article. Same old things, nutrition, TMJ dysfunction, mercury toxicity, cranial osteopathy, anti-fluoridation, kinesiology, reflexology, acupuncture, and a holistic approach. And don't they say that is what we have? It includes herbology, homeopathy, biomagnetic therapies, and oriental medicine.
How about
What's up there?
guilty?
This comes straight from the National Council Against Health Fraud, which comes straight out of the AMA. Right? Now, with a little more than this, we have a little more evidence. I think I can make out a conspiracy between the board and the National Council Against Health Fraud to suppress these therapies.
Weren't they proven already, tied up in the chiropractor suit?
Sure, that's where the National Council Against Health Fraud came from. When the chiropractors got on their case real bad, the AMA shipped its files from its Department of Investigation and its Council on Quackery out to Jug Ears Jarvis of Loma Linda, which took up the
Was
fight.
that actually proven? I mean, to the point that you think that's in that judge's files, in the sealed files, you can prove that?
Yeah, all of these documents, I mean, you know whether or not do you all know how we got these documents?
No, it's not.
Tell it.
All right.
The sore throat of the.
Well, Sore Throat was the Church of Scientology, right? Out in LA many years ago, the APA got the AMA to jump on the Scientologists because they said they were practicing psychiatry without a license. And they had this beautiful building, I don't remember, somewhere in LA, and they came out with the FBI and they took sledgehammers and beat all the doors down, arrested all these people, threw the founder's wife in prison. So the Scientologists struck back. They have hundreds of thousands of members, and some of them are very clean-cut looking young ladies and gentlemen with college degrees. They got them a white sidewall haircut, bought them a new suit, sent them out to the employment agencies until they got jobs at the AMA, where they became absolutely indispensable little clerks. Boy, they rushed around there all day and all night, just working like hell. And every night when everybody else left, they sat there at the copy machine and they copied the entire AMA files and carried them out in briefcases. And boy, have we got some embarrassing things out of those files for these guys. You should read the minutes of the National Health Information Control Council. They had it at the ADA one time, the AMA another time, American Association of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers. They moved around the country holding these. And they keep minutes. And they put the end stamps and they sign them and they talk about wiping all these things out. And this is a mixture of our tax funds and private interest going on. It's not so bad that happens. People conspire all the time, but they have to keep minutes of the conspiracy. And we've got the minutes. And, when I heard about all this, I didn't really, I said, well, I want to go find out about it. So I went down to Clearwater to the Church of Scientology. And I walked into their headquarters and said, I want to talk to you guys about the AMA files. You know anything about the AMA files? I said, well, I'm sure you don't. But maybe you can help me find somebody that does. He says, who the hell are you? I said, I'm Bill Moore, I'm a lawyer, and I represent a bunch of unorthodox practitioners. She says, come in here and sit down. They bought me a couple of drinks and gave me supper, and then they went out and checked on me. I called around a few places, came back and said, okay, you're who you say you are, you really do it. We don't have those files, but we might be able to help you find them. What part of the files would you be interested in? So I gave him the broad areas, and this guy wrote this down. He went upstairs and got on a fax machine. And he started punching the button. Over the next 3 months, I kept getting these strange packages in plain brown wrappers from all over the United States. It was the AMA files. Right? Now, they don't have them in their headquarters. I don't know where they got them, but if you get with these people, they'll let you have them, right? I mean, they hate the AMA worse than anything on the face of the earth. They call me up all the time, Bill, is there anything else we can do to help you get those bastards? They are some of the people I'm talking about that are your allies. They hate your enemy. And they got all these files. And then they, among other things, they gave them to Chet Wilton, the chiropractor, who took them in, and they're sealed in that court case. They can be unsealed.
How big a stack have you got?
Oh, a couple of filing cabinets full here. I mean, you wouldn't want the entire AMA files. It would fill several rooms this size, and a lot of it's uninteresting. And what I got's admittedly edited by other people in an effort to help me. They sent me what they thought I wanted. I have never had the opportunity to go to the mother lode and personally look through. Somebody sent me what they thought would be helpful. Joe Lisa has a lot of these. Joe Lisa, you know Joe. Joe was the one who devised the sore throat program. He was the head of the Department of Intelligence for the Church of Scientology when they did this. Was Joe's idea. And Joe's got a lot more of them. Now, I'll give them to anybody that wants them. Joe sells them. That's how he makes his living. I don't make my living that way. I use Joe in my cases whenever I can because he's a hell of a good investigator. But Joe's not an eleemosynary institution like our association is. Joe has got a lot of these goods. Other people have got them too. But in conspiracy, you know, the courts hold that conspiracy itself, being subtle, is capable of being proven by subtle evidence. You don't ordinarily get conspirators who keep minutes and put their official seals on like the AMA do. And you get the judge convinced that the conspiracy is going on, he's going to listen to you. Here we have this together with some of the other stuff that they put. That's about enough to convince a reasonable judge that these people have something to do with the drive against the kind of ministry that you practice. Now you want to take it back to where, you know, from the chain, from the AMA down to the ADA, and the influence that the ADA has. I mean, this is holy writ when you get before your board. Right? They have already characterized what you're doing as quackery.
No, I think they're using the word fraud, which makes it criminal.
Fortunately, the judge commented on that in dismissing Victor Herbert's suit the other day about fraud. Herbert was trying to hold us in Fort Highway on the theory that we had committed fraud. And the judge says if what he's talking about is they treat their patients in a way that disagrees with him, that is not fraud. Now that was just an incidental finding in dismissing the lawsuit against a bunch of us at Herbert filed.
And it wouldn't be, would it be written up at least with those comments?
Yeah, well, listen, if anybody needs it, they can call me. I'll send them I'll copy my personal copy.
Can you sum up and then maybe we can get these overheads and duplicate them?
They're right there. You can have them. I've said what I need to say. I mean, you know, I could talk for another 18 hours, or I should have.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We appreciate it. We'll have some questions toward the end of the day, but go ahead with the one question if you have the question.
What about using this Title 15, Section 26 against the Medicare?
Well, that's against the government. That's a monopoly that Congress set up. There's another way to get to them. That's mandamus. But you can't sue the federal government for monopolizing. They're the ones that made the law that says you can't monopolize, and they accepted themselves from that law.
What about the carriers that are supposed to be acting in the government's behalf?
Now that may be a different matter, although as a general proposition, the insurance industry, while conducting the business of insurance, is exempt from the antitrust laws. That doesn't mean they're totally exempt. If what they're doing is outside the business of insurance, they can be named. There are other ways to get at them. I'll talk to you about it later this afternoon.
Okay, I'll get up and then stretch for just a couple seconds, then we'll have Doug come up and get started. Doug, in case you don't, Doug Leber is our next presenter for today. And he's going to talk on the physics of living systems. And this is the first time that material has been presented in this way. Doug is the inventor of the Computron and several other electronic instruments, and he has a good mastery of what goes on in the instruments. So we'll all have a focus. Fortunate to have have Dr. Wing Pond come and talk to us about some new concepts, new physics that are being applied to medicine. And first we'll start off with Doug, so if everyone would take their seat, we get going. This is what we're all here for. Has everyone liked the seminar so far? And there's a few people, information junkies, that say we don't get enough information. Okay, but we can satisfy them. We'll print up some more things. Okay, Doug, it's all yours. Gary can help you. That's part of the physics he's going to talk about.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Good to be here. I think Ed actually first asked me, must have been about 3 years ago. He said we need to have a class. Sort of said we need bonehead physics for these people here. And I don't know if that's implying that your boneheads. We assume that you know you have a good mastery of lots of things that have gotten you to the point where you are. But of course, physics traditionally hasn't been a necessary foundation point in learning medicine dentistry. It's a bit of a more recent addition, and medicine, of course, has been much more solidly based in the chemistry side of understanding what happens in the body. But we're finding now that there are things that we're working with that we're dealing with that we can't explain with chemistry. That model has some limitations. And so we've been waiting for a while here till we had enough people, I guess, ready to hear and learn some things of physics. So what the purpose of this is to give a foundation of a lot of concepts that are important, because a lot of people will ask you, well, what are you doing? How does that work? And we get into things like with the electroacupuncture testing. You put this little vial and you put it in the test plate in the circuit, and it makes the body's response, the resistance on the meter change. You try to say, well, how did that happen? They didn't eat it, didn't swallow it, didn't even hold it in their hand. So it takes a understanding of some concepts, energetic fields, interactions that occur to make some sense. So the idea here, first of all, is to help you to get a model and some concepts inside your own head so you can explain to yourself what you're doing. And then understand things enough that you can explain to somebody else a little bit of what's happening. And you don't need to have the details, you don't have to know all the mathematical equations of physics. I'm not going to be going over that. And I'm not a physicist myself. We do have Wing Pond, and he's going to come in and present from a point of view of someone who has looked at all of the theories and who knows physics very well, to cover a little of that a little bit later on this morning. But what I want to do is to get the concepts across, get the basic ideas so that you can understand it. And I'll be using a lot of, as we go along, metaphors, analogies, things in ordinary everyday life that will give you a grasp of some of these concepts. And it's, in many ways, it really isn't that that difficult. But there are some concepts that are a little out of the mechanistic type of thinking that we've tended to come to learn. One thing I wanted to go over a little bit was just to set the stage here of why the world is the way it is, and one reason why we have to fight some of these struggles and these fights that we have. And what we have is a particular worldview and a particular model of how things happen that has been passed down to us. We've sort of inherited this particular system, and we have the authorities, the sort of establishment powers that be, having adopted a particular system in terms of physics that goes back to Isaac Newton, and of course that goes back a number of things. But Newton really formulated a system in physics, and physics really deals with the interaction. I'm going to cover a few definitions here before we dive here, but physics is the interaction of matter and energy, and the study of how that happens, which basically is what everything around us is made up of. And let's look right here. At one level, we can have a scheme of understanding the different sciences. Really, the principles of physics is the foundation for everything else, because that, for example, will govern in a chemical reaction why do two molecules or two elements attract each other or repel each other. And then, from that, from simple chemistry, we have biochemical, molecular kinds of interactions. We move into our anatomy, physiology, and then the psychological functions, and then all the other areas of the softer type sciences, behavioral and political, social types of sciences. And physics has become a foundation, because the way that we think of the world will then permeate other parts of our thought. But so biology takes its cues from physics, but it's about a century behind the times. And so what we see here is not surprising that the newer views of physics, which appeared about 1900, are coming on, but biology has finally taken and been implementing the mechanistic type of physics, which comes from some concepts of Newton, which are describing, for example, how planets move and what guides their process, or gravitational fall of these major forces. And there's a specific area where Newton's descriptions are very valuable, and they're very close to predicting reality. And so they're useful, but the problem comes in over-generalizing and saying something that describes a very specific phenomenon now has to describe everything else in life. And so we've seen a shift in biological thinking to think of living systems as simply a machine, simple little box where we do one thing here and the one always the same predictable result happens at the other end. And our experience tells us that isn't true. We sort of have to deny or to suppress certain kinds of things that we know from experience with their choices. We say, well, I sat down, I looked at this menu, and I decided I was going to have this for lunch rather than something else. Mechanistic view says no, because of the event that happened the day you were born. You couldn't have chosen otherwise, because this caused this and this and this and this and this. And that can result in more of a this idea of seeing that there's just a continual clockwork that goes on that shows that there's no other forces except those measurable, visible sources of influence that will be there. Let's look on to let me describe a couple things here. So I wanted to quote a few things here. There are a number of books that are out, a number of good books here. I've got a whole suitcase full if anybody's interested to peruse and look at some other books of explanations of quantum biology and quantum physics, all these interactions right there. But I wanted to take a moment just to look at the basis of the scientific approach that we're using and some of the limitations and fallacies that occur. These are scientists that are describing that. But he says there appear to be many, many levels of interpretation and memory involved in every act of perception. That's one of the things we're doing, is we observe something and try to describe it. Science supposedly is trying to find the truth about the way things work. And as many psychiatrists knows it, if we were to completely separate such multiple levels of interpretation from any connection with our waking life, or to condense those levels into one and become completely literal, we'll be on the road to insanity or disease. And that's referring to a point of view that said, well, this is this part of the universe, and that's the only thing that this applies to, and we can't apply it. There's an interesting resistance to apply, a modern biologist to apply the principles of quantum physics right now, but they're very busily applying principles of the mechanistic Newtonian physics without realizing it, because it's not new anymore. So it's been part of their environment since they've been born, and they operate under a set of belief systems that they don't even question or don't even realize that they're operating under. Now, basically, the scientific method, I'll see it when I believe it. The so-called scientific method, which just as how scientists work is a fabrication. No scientist has ever written about how they work is described it that way. Any scientist who tried to work like that would probably produce little of any value, which is this totally trying to distinguish other parts of life from science. That it's a scientific truth, and what I do the rest of my life doesn't matter, where I do things on a basis of feeling, on intuition. It's extremely unlikely there can ever be such an event as a pure, unprejudiced observation. Observations are always made first within the historical cultural context, which has given someone a reason for making an observation at all. Second, within the context of the person's own belief systems and his own organism, which in turn affect the result of his observation. So there's a particular context that always is a bias. And so that's a lot of the conflict we come up against, because when it gets down to it, there's certain presuppositions that are being made, and in order to get your point across and understand things, we have to get and let that foundation and see where we need to change certain basic tenets here. At any period in the history of science, there have been interpretations rippling under the surface of the view generally agreed upon, which question that view. And this goes on. We've got Aristotle's, the 12th century, Aristotle's views were discovered. Go over to Aquinas' work. We've got Galileo, the whole idea of the Earth being the center of the universe, or is the sun the center? And as we've gone through, we've had a number of scientific revolutions, at which point it happens in two ways. One is you have a number of observations which keep being contradictory to the accepted theory, to the point that the weight is overwhelming. Or what typically will happen here is the scientists of that day, see, once the scientist has learned something, because I went to school, I learned it, that's all there is to know. If I didn't learn it in school, if I didn't learn it in medical school or college here, it can't be. So in most cases, the person either has to, the generation has to die off before that gets accepted. Or unless, if there's such a huge amount of pressure that comes through there, then the whole system will change. But we're at a point where we can either wait for them to die off, or get enough pressure and enough awareness coming that people can begin to see a little different view. The idea that Newton proposed absolute space and universal time as mere hypotheses which were necessary in order to complete the formal mathematics of his system. And so Newton himself did, however, believe and proclaim that his law of gravitation, he had revealed the Word of God. Contemporary and subsequent philosophers took up this mechanical view of the universe, applied it to interpret mind, education, politics, economics, ethics, art, religion. Thus, an essentially limited principle which had been successful in explaining the motion of the planets, tides, and balls rolling on inclined planes was taken as the final ground of everything in human life. The problem with our science, then, is not that through certain methods we've been able to discover certain cause and effect relationships in certain very limited and often unnaturally manipulated circumstances. The problem is that these principles are taken as ultimate principles which can explain phenomena outside the limited region in which they were conceived, and to exclude legitimate observations which do not fit the scheme. Interesting, there was the author of this book here was mentioning to another scientist here certain precognition, other types of phenomena, and talking about the fellow was interested in meditation. He said he follows experimental medicine. You just look and see. But his response to the query about precognition was, there are some things that we know are not true. Precognition is one of them. Therefore, in this case, experimental data is irrelevant. So that's the, I'll believe it when I see it, or perhaps I won't see it because I don't believe it. And so we run across that, which is a prejudice biased view of those that are supposedly holding to a scientific point of view. Okay, the conventionally agreed upon belief structures of any particular group of scientists forms an inseparable part of their practice of science and determines which observation will be acceptable to them and which will be rejected. From this point of view, then, science is not necessarily finding out the truth, but is merely confirming or refuting its agreed upon belief structures. And the other thing is observations may refute, but they can't confirm. So we can make a statement that comes through, and it only takes, you can do millions of observations that all agree with a particular hypothesis here. Example here, we use all the Australians have black hair. And so I've seen a few of them, they have black hair. Went down there, checked out 3 million of them, they have black hair. So that must prove the theory but you can blow it with only one blonde that comes in. So that's part of the limitation here. What we need to look at here, there's a man named Kuhn who wrote a book called about scientific revolution and described this whole phenomenon. So there are two kinds of science: normal and convention science on the one hand, and revolutionary science. Normal science, scientists are working within a particular conventionally agreed upon belief structure or set of presuppositions. Normal science is self-confining and tells us nothing about reality. In revolutionary science, the presuppositions conventionally agreed on are no longer adequate. Observations which radically refute the presuppositions cannot any longer be ignored, and a complete shift to presuppositions takes place. At this point, normal science takes over again. And so I think a lot of us that are here for that reason, that we're in the revolutionary science dealing with a shift in certain presuppositions. And there'll be a time, probably within the new physics, new biology that we're dealing with will become the accepted approach, and then it'll become very dogmatic, certain limitations come in. But being on the exciting area, interesting areas on that cutting edge, and there's some that are really set out to be the pioneer, that take some of the flack to go on through, that enjoy the discovery of the new things that aren't understood. And I think if we understand that, just realize that there's certain things that come with the territory. Part of that is that there is a particular establishment group, and their whole purpose is to perpetuate the status quo. And we're interested in truth and really getting on through and not just ignoring certain observations, and we'll need to pursue some things because of the overwhelming tilt that we've had on the mechanistic point of view. So let's go on. There's a few things just to realize here. Facts are a limited statement that agree with the results of an experiment or observation. So a fact always has to have a context. A theory or hypothesis, which are specific models in the form of, if A is true, it implies A, B, C, D. With the aim of going on to ascertain if possible whether any of A, B, C, or D are demonstrably untrue. In that case, A is either false or needs a substantial revision. And so there are facts, there's a theory or a hypothesis, and then there's an intuition or a guess concerning an overall pattern, which serves effectively if one really wants to know whether a model has substance or not, as an agenda for forming theories. And so a world model, whether we get them from our culture or thought them up for ourselves, commonly contain all three of the above. Either theory or hypothesis or a special invention of the scientific method. Formalism is that they cannot be confirmed, only refuted. So go on. Actually, most world models then are of a semi-empathetic type here. There's a part of an intuitive aspect that goes into that, because our experience, as we sum up everything that we see here, gives us a particular sense of the rightness or the confirmation of the way things are. And it's within that context then that we will pursue our research. So, let me just mention a couple other things, and I'm going to get into the basic constituents of our physical universe. Statement can be true only relative to some understanding of it. And so that it has to fit into a little broader context than just to make a statement in one sentence here. Understanding always involves human categorization, which is a function of interactional rather than inherent properties. As mentioned and observed from emerged from our experience. So we deal with categories. Categories are neither fixed nor uniform, and whether a statement's true depends on whether the category employed in the statement fits. That in turn varies with human purposes and other aspects of context. And the truth of a statement is always relative to the properties that are highlighted by the categories used in the statement. For example, space is empty highlights empty, and it's all true relative to lack of oxygen. So we have to make certain categories, and that's always necessary to talk about something. We have to divide things up, and we say, well, we've got to have at least two categories so I can make a statement comparing the subject and object. And so the language that we use and the divisions that we make have a very important role to play in how we can describe something. And in one sense, the categories that we make appear purely arbitrary. Because we simply decide, we just make it up. We decide, well, I'm going to have, the Chinese have the concept of yin and yang, which gives us an idea of polarity. So there's the negative pole, there's the positive. And so in taking what's around us, we can, at one level of trying to describe the universe, we can say, I'm going to take a line and I'm going to cut the whole place in half, and we're going to say, we can do right here, here's a little barrier, that's sort of a natural way to do that. So we could say, well, you're all the lefties because you're on my left hand, and you're all the righties because you're over there. And that's one way to do that. Or another one, we can draw a funny little kind of a squiggly line that goes on through, and it says, well, these all are male, and these ones here are female, and they'll divide it up in all different ways. So the divisions, as we look at something, basically we look at certain common characteristics to help us divide that, and that gives some understanding, some meaning, but it's only within that context. Let's look a little bit more here. We talked about then a world model, which gets beyond hypothesis, which is sort of an all-encompassing view that tries to make sense of how everything fits together. And that is part of our whole overall context or foundation for how we look at things. A world model is not a hypothesis. They're an agenda for research. And if one is seriously interested in checking them against what is the case. They're matters of uncheckable personal conviction if they're not accessible to research. There is another area we would say is pseudoscience. Okay, that's not a world model formation, but it's an attempt to justify a world model, or part of one, and that can't come at a beginning of a formation of something and blocked by collecting anecdotal instances without the formation or testing of critical theories. In other words, it mistakes an agenda for a theory and then attempts to justify the theory by instances rather than perform critical experiments. Now, a lot of the type of information that comes out of a clinical practice, observations are made. Just looking at around us consists of these anecdotal types of instances which give us a good idea of certain kinds of patterns, because certain things tend to show up that can give us an idea for a hypothesis to test something out. And in this area, there's a lot more research that we could be structuring and putting together to confirm a lot of the things that we're doing, especially in this country where we need to be doing our own research. So I think it's important to do that and to move in here. But there's a value of that area, but we need to recognize what is science and what is pseudoscience. But at one level, we just made everything on up and we give different importance to each of them also. Natural history is a model of its own. It's a detailed description of observation with little or no experiment or interpretation. And that is much of the type of thing that can be done just as an observer of nature as you go in your practice. I see that with myself. A lot of what I'm doing is observing many things, setting up some small experiments, but that can give a lot of useful information of just observing nature, observing phenomena around us. Okay, the other type of the model hypothesis reality testing here is they're called the Rosetta Stone effect. And applies to languages or models closely similar to language, such as the DNA code, which interpretation can be considered to be verified if it produces comprehension. And that's another area of investigation that we're moving more into as we're coming to understand what things mean. There's the DNA, the more molecular deciphering process, and one area I've been involved with is deciphering the energetic fields. One of the things I've been doing is measuring the sequence of colors in the force field of the person, and that produces a type of language that can be deciphered and interpreted by what that means. But I want to make another couple things about limitations of the scientific method that we've been using. When we get into the implications of modern physics here, looking at the atom subatomic particles, and which is an objective area, and the subjective area is human thought and feeling. Modern science has shown us that a stringent objectivity has evaporated, since the world does not exist for us as an object. Pure objectivity, unadulterated by human values, is an illusion. This position is poignantly advanced by the Nobel physicist Eugene Wigner, who asserts that even the physical objects and spiritual values have a similar kind of reality. When we get down to these very small particles, they can be influenced by very, very weak aspects. And the idea that you can be a totally independent observer and not influence the outcome of the experiment. Now, for dealing with how Jupiter moves around the sun, your body won't have too much influence on that, whether you're paying attention to Jupiter or not. But there is, if we look at the interactive process, the whole idea that we're dealing with is that everything puts out an energetic field, puts out waves, and waves keep going on forever once they're started, and at some level of vibration. And so what you do here is going to have ripple effects that go on out through there. And the smaller the object that we're looking at, a subatomic particle, something very small, the more that can be influenced. If we're trying to look at what's inside, what goes on inside an anthill, unless you can get smaller than the ant and go sneak inside there, then you rip the whole thing up here. And we say, well, ants, they scurry around all the time. That's what they must be doing in their natural state, and we take this thing over. But you can't, at one level, you can't get in there and observe what's going on without then disrupting it. When you try to look at electrons specifically and see what they would be doing, they won't do the same thing that they'd be doing if you weren't looking at them when you're looking at them. Because it's such a small thing that you'll disrupt what would happen. So that brings us to the blurring here of what's objective and subjective, but that's been the standard of science, is to try to maintain this objectivity. In terms of quantum biology, which is what we're going to get into, found a strong reluctance on the part of bioscientists to apply concepts drawn from modern physics to biological systems. The feeling is that it just applies to this one little area, but one may apply quantum concepts to neutrinos, protons, and quarks, but not to dogs, cats, human beings. Is the idea there, but we're finding that that's not so. We're moving in here to describe the little different model here, just like in drug pharmacology research. Early development was believed that the shape of the messenger molecule makes a big difference. The mechanistic view is that the world that is a rigid structure, it's a lock and key. The only way a door can open is you put the key in there, you turn it, and it goes open. And so geometry would explain everything. We take our little tinker toy molecules and we build something, and only the spatial arrangement is probably important from one molecule than another. So what difference does it make with quantum mechanics and energy fields? And one of the principles that I use to look at is that our technology that's around us is what can help us understand what goes on, but it also can limit. So we think the door's only open when you put a key in there and unlock that. But I go to the grocery store, and when I'm about 6 feet away, 8 feet away from that door, it opens for me, just by itself. And of course, we didn't have grocery stores like that 200 years ago. But how can that door open when I didn't even touch it? But that's a phenomena, and if we've been able to invent it, the idea of mankind has invented the technology that it already existed in nature somewhere. We just have to find it. And so our technology, see, we have machines back, and we can say, well, yes, the body's like a machine. And we have pulleys, we have things that move, we can have wheels spin around. Now we have computers. And they're a little different kind of device here that deals not with the mechanistic action. We have the recording tape. And on there we have information that's being stored, but it's not, we know what's on there, there's no mechanical change to that tape. There's an energetic field change as those iron particles are reoriented. But that can make the whole difference on what happens when you pop it in the player and it comes out the other end. You feel a static or you see a recording of something. And so our technology now is giving us some hooks in our mind to begin to hang some phenomena that occur that people in the past didn't have any hooks. They didn't have a model. They didn't have anything to compare it to that would describe it as well. Okay, how can quantum mechanical concepts conceivably apply to this physiological domain? Quantum physicists are not concerned with shapes, but with fields. In quantum mechanics, molecules are not stick-and-ball entities with rigid angulations, but entities whose electrons generate more or less of force in one area, similar to a magnet. The composition and conformation of these variegated fields of force within and around molecules that determine whether attraction or repulsion will occur when two molecules meet. Okay, this force field quality is obviously quite different than the square block and square hole conception based on geometrical considerations only. Yes. Okay. Can you hear better now? Okay. So that's a little bit of what some other writers have been saying, and let's look a little bit. Yes.
Where did you read from? What were you reading from?
With these, I pulled several of those, and I would have to. Let's see. I'll have to get to you which authors.
Oh, okay, the
These came
combination.
from right here. I pulled some of these things out and had noted on here which author was which. Should acknowledge that, but I'll go back on several of those.
These are books from quantum physics and physiology.
quantum physics and physiology. What I'll do here is, during lunch here, is I'll spread out here a number of those books that you can take a look at. And there's new biology, new physics, quantum mechanics, some of them that are written more just for explanation of physics, other ones that get into, some written by MDs, some by physicists, others that pull it all together. And we're dealing with a more expanded worldview of things, but there's a lot that's been written that's a very useful background in understanding things. So let's take a look at, then in physics, here we've got all kinds of things that make up our physical world, from the entire universe down to what they call the Planck length here, which is the very subatomic, very small particles here. And this is an idea of our physical universe, how big these things are. So this is size. It covers a very wide spectrum. Now another type of diagram here, we'll look at here the electromagnetic spectrum that we deal with. And these are, we got, should I just go to this microphone? Okay. And so this is the electromagnetic area that goes from down here. We've got radio waves, microwaves, infrared, we've got invisible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, cosmic, gamma rays at the higher level. And we do have the section of visible light, which is what we're most familiar with our eyesight, which sees and divides things into different colors. And we'll get a little bit more into implications for that. But that gives us, the idea of colors gives us a kind of a concept of the different qualities of energy that can exist across that spectrum, just as we sense and experience different qualities to different colors. Red being a very active type quality, blue is a calming, quiet, peaceful type color. And but it is within this area here that there are a lot of frequencies that influence our own body, because we're resonating at various frequencies, different parts of us. Now we need to look at what is generating frequencies and what the universe is made up of. And here we have a picture of what is the idea of the electron shell around the proton. This is an atom. The Greeks were the ones that gave this concept. The atom is the smallest particle that things are made up of. And that was a view that says everything has units that are particles that are little small pieces, and they're all assembled and built together to make some big item. And it was actually not till the early part of this century that the models, the Bohr model of the atom was developed. And any model that we have of the atoms really is just a model. It may not be reality, but it helps us predict interactions. Little stick and figure versions are not the atom itself. Now what's found, and of course the basic concept of the atom here, it has a nucleus which has a proton that is a fairly heavy subatomic particle. Then there's an electron, and electrons move in a orbit or a shell that's around the proton, and it's about 1 1,836 times lighter than the proton. But they're both considered then to have mass, which will be, can be influenced in a certain way with gravity. There's another subatomic particle, which is the common one, the neutron, which weighs as much as the proton, and it tends to go in there, but it has no charge. Now, these represent the proton as a positive charge, electron as a negative charge. And since it's out here, it can move, it can go into other orbits, it can share. That's why in chemistry, where we have an extra electron or a missing electron, then they like to share each other, and they'll come together and create a bond, chemical bond, atomic interaction. But now in the atomic nucleus, the new idea here is that there's a smaller particle, and now the newest idea of the smallest particle is the quark, Q-A-R-K. And quarks like to come here and do triplets into threes. And the quark theories now are dealing with different colors of quarks that in the model there that combine in different fashions that produce different kinds of particles here from that. But this concept here of the triangle of 3 points we'll find is a very useful one in understanding. I use that in determining color interactions, and I find that a useful model. Wing-Pon will be describing a number of his theories that have made sense out of a lot of the physical and metaphysical phenomena, and with a comprehensive theory. And that is based on interactions of 3 points, not just 2, on the dual nature. So we then have elements. This is just a comparison here of a lot of the different elements, comparing the number of protons versus how many neutrons they have. You all know your atomic periodic table of elements will give atomic weights of all these elements. And those are based by adding together the entire mass of that item, which comes from protons added to neutrons. And there may be more neutrons than protons in the elements, giving more mass. This is another chart that looks at the elements that exist, and this is relative abundance of the elements that make up the universe. So we've got lots of hydrogen and helium and carbon, oxygen, and so on down there. And it makes sense that those elements that are most abundant tend to make up most of our body, and they tend to be the more important elements that come into play.
Doug, are photons larger than protons?
A photon? Well, photon, see, Wing-Pon smiling there. Okay, a photon comes, the idea is the photon is considered to be a unit of light. And so it has no mass.
It's similar to a neutron. No charge?
No. Okay, it doesn't have any mass. That's the thing about that. But it can act like a particle. And that gets into one of the controversies which we're going to look at in physics, which was looking at, well, here we have all kinds of forces that are out there that influence things. We have gravitational forces, electric forces, magnetic forces. Then we get electromagnetic combining together. We have molecular forces which hold things together, and that combines here with electromagnetic. And it's a sort of a scheme of classifying all these different forces that exist in physics. We'll get to this question about the photons in just a little bit. But the forces, there are different strengths of all these forces then. And as we go on through here, we have a different amount of energy, molecules up here. It's here, whatever, 10 to the first. Here, and these are, electrovolt energies here. Atoms. We move down here to the this area. They say there's an energy desert right through here. These are these very weak forces here. And in physics, there's a concept of strings, which are very tiny little forces that tie and hold things together. But we don't need to get much more into detail, but there's a
What is quark?
quark.
You say,
Yeah, quark is the hypothesize is the smallest particle that's the subatomic particle that everything else is made up of. So it's just this tiniest thing.
well, there was one that was black. What's the difference between the two?
Now what now?
You had, on your scale there, you had black or black, whatever it was.
It's true.
Oh, on strings here?
Yeah. Where does the quark fit in there? Or does it?
We're talking about forces here, not
These are forces,
particles.
Okay.
but a quark is this idea. The idea is that there are particles. Now that's there are two things that we find. There are waves that are everywhere simultaneously. If I have a wave that's splashing down here on the beach at Monterey, it could be the same wave up there splashing where I live up in Seattle. Could be the same wave hitting down at LA, Huntington Beach, somewhere down there, and South America, and wherever. A wave continues going on, and it has no locality. It just keeps going, and it keeps perpetuating. It's everywhere. And that's part of reality. But then a particle has this other property that says it's at one place at one time, and a particle can't be everywhere at once. Can't be here and there. Has to be at one place. And it's the interaction between those. The particle then can have mass.
Does the quark have any energy?
There's a Wayne Cloud, how do you answer that?
What's the question?
Does a quark have energy?
Oh, yeah, quite a bit of
Yeah.
energy.
What's that?
Yes,
Yes.
but the mass of the quark is still uncertain yet. Essentially, the quark is really the free particle that combine, that bind the nucleus. And that's why it's very hard to detect quark alone, because it's kind of like gluing the nucleus together.
Yeah, they.
And the force that glue the nucleus together, what they call, is in the gluon. It's pretty complicated, but there's a lot of you have gluon that also jump between quarks.
Are electrons made out of quarks?
The quarks is only tied with the nucleus. Okay, it's interaction inside the nucleus.
So it's not the
The,
big
the,
particle
the
of
electron is what they call the class of element called leptons, which is alone.
Yeah, the quarks, they don't find them alone. And if you get into the subatomic particles, there's like over 200 subatomic particles that they're describing, and it gets very confusing because they keep trying to split things smaller and smaller, and they keep finding more things every time they do that. And so what we want to do here is just sort of get an overall conception of how these things deal with that. And I guess if you have some questions about these specific subatomic kinds of things, Wing Pond will be able to give you a little more detail on that. This is just some lines of force. This is a copper crystal that was being stimulated by X-rays, and showing that when you vibrate or stimulate something, out comes some lines of force, force field that exists that can be stimulated. This is a process of what happens with waves. Here we have a wave that comes on through and goes through a slit. That then generates a smaller, some semicircular waves that move on through. Now waves can then, the same wave can go through both slits at the same time. And that will then produce an interference pattern, because then suddenly you have two semicircular waves that are coming through from these two new places that came from that original wave. And so on a screen, then you get a particular pattern of light and dark that is produced that is based on that interference field. Now what happens is if you block one of those little gaps in the hole there, you won't get the interference field. You simply get the wave that comes through here, it will come through the other one. And this is a little bit about how waves function. Now a wave, see, those are drawing waves as like concentric circles. You know, if you throw a rock in a pond, you're going to get a bunch of waves that come out, and the space between those is going to tell us our wavelength. So we have, let me get a mark on here. But another way of looking at that wave is looking at then the peak and the trough. See, if we're looking straight down, we'd see this one and this one and this peak right here as just these concentric lines. But looking sideways, we see that the wave is a continuing undulation of the field strength that goes up to a peak, then it comes down. Now, we can take a wavelength, and that goes from one point to another. Okay, from here to here is the length then between the wave. Or we could take it from here to here if we wanted to. It'd be the same thing, a wavelength. And this is basically a sinusoidal curve here, but this is, you see waves, it repeats itself over and over again, and it has then a consistent length between those. Now one thing that we can do is to take a second wave. Now this is a wave here that is double the frequency of the first wave. Okay, where the first one went through only one cycle, this one goes through two. Now if I take and I add those two waves together, we then get a third wave right here, which is a little different. And what this wave now has in there are harmonics. And so we can see it still has this basic pattern that's based on the original wavelength, but in there is another pattern of this other second frequency, summation. So it has some harmonics. Inherent in there is its fundamental wavelength plus then these other harmonics, which represent higher frequencies, which is modulated or carried by that wave. We can even get more modulation if we even add a higher frequency. Then we'd get something that would be modulating on here. If we were to add another frequency. And if we add another frequency on here, then these would have other little squiggles to them that would create even more complexity and more frequencies that exist simultaneously that are harmonics that are being carried by that. And so we can have very complex set of frequencies and oscillations present in the wave. When we look at it then on the oscilloscope, for example, all the little peaks and valleys and little undulations on that could be broken on down to see what the inherent frequencies are that have been all added together to make this very complex set of oscillations. So in the body, we have a number of frequencies that all exist simultaneously, and that would create some very complex waveforms if we could measure all of that. The problem with the human body is that the field strength of those, many of the oscillations is below the level of white noise in the background. So it gets drowned out just by with our instruments, or just to see the noise generated by the recording instrument. Try to record conversation, but the tape recorder puts out so much noise that you can't hear the speaker because it's louder than the signal that comes in. Now you would be recording what the speaker is saying, but it is masked in that background. In order to find that, you have to find a way to amplify. If we can't get rid of the noise, then somehow we've got to amplify the signal. And that becomes the challenge in measuring these the number of the oscillations in the body and the energies, is our instruments are so crude to try to directly measure what's going on, that the thing we're looking for is drowned out by this noise. So there's the concept of waves. We have another concept here which deals with density of matter. And this is a little illustration here. We have with Newton's idea of an absolute universe, which would exist there whether there was anything there or not. The idea is that you have, here's two objects. Here's a sun and a planet that's going around that. They just move through space, empty space, which says there's nothing there. With the newer physics, we're seeing that empty space is not empty. It's made up of something that's in there. Even the space that is, we say, well, an atom is mostly empty space. There's this little bitty nucleus, and then there's an electron that's moving all around, but what's in between? And we have this idea that there's a void of some kind, and that's a presupposition of the Newtonian idea that there is no interaction, that there's nothing in that space. But in the ideas of modern physics, we have something in there. We have waves that get propagated. For example, light acts like a wave that propagates through space, through a vacuum. And so what is it that propagates that? Now, the physicists in the past were talking about an ether, but they couldn't find what that stuff was, so that was a discarded concept here of this substance that makes up the space that's around us. And there's some ideas now of particles that are, I'll get into that, but get into ideas that move into like matter, antimatter, and things that are a shadow type of a particle that exists in some theories to try to make sense out of that. But the idea here of density, that is concentration. For example, the greater the density of something, the greater gravitational effect it will have.
Why do they need ether? Why do they need ether to get light through it? Can you tell me that?
Well, a wave has to have a medium to be propagated.
Can't just be itself?
A particle doesn't need the idea particle is a little packet, and I can shoot a bullet, and this bullet will go back there, and it would go, in fact, whatever's in the way, it has to push that out of the way to get through there. But a wave, just like if I'm going to talk, if we had a vacuum here, you couldn't hear my voice, because that goes by sound waves that are carried by vibrating the air, and that causes your eardrum to vibrate, and then that in turn triggers some nerves, and so voice waves, sound waves don't travel through a vacuum. Okay, if I throw water, if I put a rock into the pool, out comes some waves. If the pool's empty, nothing goes.
But radio waves do. Radio waves do travel through a vacuum. Is that correct? Otherwise, they go out in space.
In space.
They go out in space. So
yeah, we have a vacuum, but then the idea is there anything there, or is there nothing? Is it a total void?
Energy. That's the question.
So what is it? So there's energy, and we see in the electromagnetic field these types of things, like light and radio waves, can move through a vacuum. So how do they do it?
Yeah, how do they do it?
Do they know?
No, they don't.
Well,
that's the problem.
We have theories. All of it's theories to try to figure things out.
Theory says we don't know. Right? Like light, we don't know either.
Yes.
Electricity, right?
You had mentioned something about your work with color. And
Yes.
that you were differentiating problems with the order of color that you can take and perceive coming from an individual. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, I have a method of measuring color of the force field of the person. Found there are 5. Let me just describe the experimental method that I used. I can take a moment just to jump into that.
Doug?
Yes.
That's a question.
Uh-huh.
Is there any way that an electromagnetic wave could travel on light or through light as a medium?
Electromagnetic wave is light.
Aren't
Yeah,
lasers that?
That is a type of light. Remember, we had this electromagnetic spectrum that goes up through there. The visible light just happens to be that portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that's traveling at whatever, about 430 trillion cycles per second is how fast it's vibrating.
So light.
That's
is the
perceived
same.
as visible light. Now, if it's going faster than a certain limit here, then you can't see it. It goes past violet, and that becomes ultraviolet, and you don't see it, but it's there, and there's ways to detect it. The same thing, infrared. There's heat, which is in the infrared area, which we don't see. Bees, for example, can see it with their eyes, but we feel the heat of that, and that's another form. Then we get down to microwaves and radar, and then radio waves that cover this whole spectrum of the electromagnetic.
So what you're saying is we don't know how light travels either then through empty space or through vacuum.
Well, I'm going to give a model here that a physicist in Germany named Burkhard Heim, has developed, which is very useful to understand a number of these things. Let me draw a little something right here. The idea, we have the human body, and you've got a skeleton and tissues and everything that are inside. But where is the edge of you? Okay, well, the edge of your body is right here, but is that the edge of where you respond? Touch right here, and I can know I'm touching right here, but I'm at the edge of my hair. But even if you've ever done this is done in Qigong. Take your hands and begin to, and just pay attention to the sensations on your hands and start to push them together. As you get to a certain point, you feel kind of a resistance. There's something that you're having to push against. You go slowly. There's a magnetic field that comes out of your hands. And if you've got your nervous system and then your senses tuned in there, you'll get a little kind of a tingling or a little sensation of some kind as they come together. So you're pushing against something of a different, how many of you can feel that? Okay. So we've got a bunch of people agree that something happens here. So there's a field of some kind. There's a process of Kirlian photography. How many have seen Kirlian photographs? That's where you put a high voltage, high frequency signal through a substance, and then you take a picture on a photographic plate, and it shows a kind of a aura and a force field that's around the object. And the interesting thing with that Kirlian photography is you can, for example, take a leaf and you cut off the edge of the leaf, and here's a leaf here, and we chop this thing off. But in the Kirlian photograph, it shows an energy field that shows that missing piece as if it's still there in terms of its energy field outline. So there's a field that exists even if the physical matter part of the substance is missing. Around the body, there's a, in the metaphysics area, there's been a lot of talking about auras, force fields, and so I decided to investigate that to see, well, is there an aura? There's a doctor from Germany who, Frank Barr, has been using Dr. Nogier's techniques of the vascular autonomic signal. That's been presented in some of these seminars. How many of you are not familiar at all with that idea? Got a few?
Look out there.
But there's a pulse reflex that's done. It's a way to monitor the autonomic nervous system. And that is done by just taking the typical methods. Take the thumb, you would hold on to the wrist of the patient, put your thumb over the radial artery, get about the middle position. The Chinese have 3 pulses. You take that middle one. Right as imagine the bone of the radius starting to widen up toward the wrist, right in this little area of the radial artery, you're going to put your thumb on here and be feeling the pulsing of the radial artery right in this little spot. And that will change when you introduce a type of energy into the body's field that it resonates to. And so Nogier's done a lot of work with putting magnets up to the body and pulling them away. He does a lot through the ear, putting a positive end of a battery, negative poles, getting responses, just shining a light, a little flashlight, and he found different skin on the forehead or on the arm and the hand. One was a sympathetic reaction, the other was a parasympathetic reaction. And you could get a different response. And what tends to happen is on the thumb you feel a place where the pulse is strongest, and when you induce this influence, the place where you feel the bounding of the pulse will either shift, and you feel it here, or it'll shift this way and you feel it up this way. And what you then will sense is that the pulse can either get stronger or it'll feel weaker, almost can disappear where you can't even feel it. So the area where this pulse, see the heart is beating and the arteries are pulsing. So if you think of the artery pulses, there are certain places along the artery where we have a wave that's going, and if we're feeling at the peak of that wave, we'll get this response. Now what will happen is there's a phase shift, and that the wave moves somewhere else. So if you're monitoring it right here, you're now feeling the trough. You're feeling instead of the peak of the wave, and then you know it disappears. You don't feel it as that shifts. So that was a method of monitoring this autonomic response. Dr. Bohl developed another method with measuring electrical conductance on the body and acupuncture points. It's another autonomic response of the body. In this country, muscle testing, kinesiology, was another method that was developed that could pick up autonomically induced changes in responses. The dilation of the pupil is under control of the autonomic system. And some people have done that, but it takes a special setup here to be able to measure exactly the diameter of the pupil and see its change. But that would be another method to monitor a response of the autonomic system. But what Barr did, to use a little device that Nogier had come up with, it was like a little flashlight and with a little turret that would spin around, and you could change the beam of different colors that would come out of this with these little gel filters. And so he told me a little experiment that he'd done, and I went back and tried that myself, because he didn't see auras. But the psychics and the people said, well, there's auras and they're this color and that color. And so he said, well, I've got a method here, let me try that out. And that was to then take the beam of light and shine it through the energy field, but not toward the body, but at a tangent through the body. So I would shine it, just go beside somebody's head or beside their body. And I did the same thing, took the little flashlight, took the little different colors of gel, would shine it through. If there's an aura out there that's connected to you that you respond to, and I'm going to shine something through there and keep trying colors until something responds. So we would take, for example, maybe start out a couple feet away, try red. Keep moving on up closer and closer. Suddenly you get about 3 inches away and the pulse changes. So we say, aha, here is the edge of a red responsive zone for this person. And they wouldn't get the response with any other color. Try yellow, you try blue, makes no reaction. As soon as red comes within 3 inches, then the pulse changes. And Andy, question?
Well, does that mean that the red is in sync with whatever the wavelength is that exists, or that it disrupts the wavelength? What does it mean that it resonates with what's there already?
Well, there's a concept of sympathetic resonance. This is used to measure things that are very weak. And let's say there's a signal. I mentioned, let's say there's some background noise. That exists, we'll come back to that. Let's say there's a wave that exists, but the background noise is right here. And so I can only measure, and let's see, that's a weak signal. Where's my other colors? Let's see, that'll work. I just found out what I did with
You lay it right alongside the machine.
and did I put them up here?
No, right alongside the machine there.
Yeah, right. These days, where's that? Okay,
Right
side.
there. Yeah. One, right, one plastic. You got your hand on it.
There, it's underneath the sheet.
Are they underneath the sheet? Did somebody
Okay.
ask their solution to the mystery?
Now put 'em on.
Okay. Okay, now maybe there's some other frequencies that are much stronger, like this, okay? Now you can measure those because they come up above our baseline. Okay? Like so. But these other ones down there are too weak to pick up. But if I then will take, see, the amplitude is very weak. If I then take a tone or frequency generator and I add the same frequency to that at a higher amplitude, let's say I take